Welcome everybody to Grace Church tonight. Thank you for being here. It's our great pleasure to welcome the Primate Emeritus Anglican Church of Canada, Archbishop Fred Hiltz, who's with me tonight, and of course our very old familiar friend, the Reverend Maria Lynn, is here to help facilitate things tonight because she's so capable in so many ways. Wonderful to have you here, Maria, and to welcome those who are here in person at Grace Church tonight. Our topic is the relationship of the Anglican Church Canada to our Aboriginal Anglican Church of Canada. That is a big topic, and of course we all know in the last few decades of what a challenging relationship nationally the government has had and our people have had with our First Nation peoples. And all of us have been learning and growing in the history and the realities of this relationship. Certainly here we are in Southern Ontario, in Toronto, and we're ignorant of so much of what goes on in our country. So we're very privileged to have Archbishop Hiltz here, who has been at the center of these relationships and talks between the Aboriginal First Nations communities across Canada and as the head of the Anglican Church of Canada. Let me just say by way of introduction that Fred Hiltz was born in Nova Scotia. Hiltz, that's a good Lunenburg County name, Hiltz. And Fred Hiltz was ordained a priest in the Diocese of Nova Scotia, having first done a degree in science. He has a Bachelor of Science degree in biology, of all things, from Dalhousie University. He went on to do theological studies and was ordained in the Diocese of Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward served parishes in Sydney and Lunenburg, St. John's Lunenburg, very famous, one of the oldest churches in Canada. Some of us will remember the great fire of St. John's Lunenburg, and it was a devastating experience. That very historic church burned down, and then it was rebuilt. Well, Fred Hiltz was the rector of Lunenburg at that time. He was elected the suffragan bishop of the Diocese of Nova Scotia, and then went on to become the diocesan bishop in 2002. 5 years later, he was elected the primate of the Anglican Church of Canada and has served in that office until recently in 2019. So we know in Canadian history what has happened between 2007 and 2019. A great deal has happened in terms of our relationships and our struggles and challenges to understand the realities of our country and to find a way forward. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that finished in 2015 has left a list of all sorts of recommendations challenging the country. One of those institutions challenged, of course, is the church, and not just the Anglican Church, but tonight we're going to focus on our relationships as Anglicans within the diocese of our church. Some of us will remember that Bishop David Lehman was here just a couple of weeks ago from the Diocese of Caledonia in Northwest British Columbia. And you remember when he told us that he had 12 different language groups, Aboriginal First Nations groups in his diocese alone. Everything from the Haida out in the Queen Charlotte Islands to the Dene congregations inland over the mountains. So this is a vast country, and it has dozens and dozens and dozens of First Nations peoples, and our church has been part of the story of those communities for a couple of hundred years. So we have a lot of history. Some of that history isn't so good, and we're becoming more aware of the realities of that. But we're here to just begin understanding what our church has been, what it is now, and what it might do in the future. So it's a challenge to us here in a parish in Toronto to think about this and to think what might our role be in going forward in helping a good relationship with some of our First Nations communities. So we've asked Archbishop Hiltz to just give us some historical perspective, and there'll be some time for questions and answers. All right, so that's the agenda tonight. So welcome, Archbishop Fred Hiltz.
Thank you.
And I'd just like to begin with a prayer tonight on this Sunday evening. We're seeking light for our way forward. We've had a very mixed past, as we all know. We've been shocked as a nation to discover unmarked graves in residential schools in parts of this country. We are reeling as a nation in so many ways. Our federal government is looking for a way forward. Our churches are looking for a way forward. And individual Canadians and Christians are looking for a way forward, a path of light and healing. Be our light in the darkness, O Lord, and in your great mercy, defend us from all perils and dangers of this night. For the love of your only Son, our Savior, Jesus. Welcome back, everyone. Let's just begin with Fred Hiltz giving us an overview of his experience as primate. I'm sure it was very much a learning experience as he traveled from province to province to province, to coast to coast to coast, across Canada, meeting and learning about the realities of our First Nations communities, and that much of our church, of course, is led by our First Nations clergy and people. So I'm just going to hand over to Fred to just give us some summary from your experience as primate.
Well, thank you very much, Peter, for your warm words of welcome, and for this opportunity to be with this evening. As I look back on my years as primate from 2007 to 2019, there's no doubt in my memory that one of the largest portfolios that dominated my time and energy, and rightly so, was Truth and Reconciliation. With regard to the era of residential schools in Canada and our own part in that era as the Anglican Church of Canada, and also self-determination. It's the desire of elders to have a truly Indigenous of the Anglican Church of Canada. Those two things were very large, as writ large in my time as primate. I have to say that when I first became a bishop in Nova Scotia, that I, like many other people, was not aware, to the extent that I should be, of the history of Indian residential schools in Canada and the impact of Indigenous. Nor was I aware of our own part in that. I quickly became aware of it, and as you said, Peter, I became a learner, and I've not stopped learning. Even after I was elected primate, I was learning all the time, more and more, about this very sad chapter in the history of our country and in the history of our church. But I emerged out of my years as primate, not in a state of despair, but actually in a state of hopefulness. As I watched our church respond to the work of truth and reconciliation And as I watched our church continue to its commitment to self-determination, to honoring that desire of Indigenous people to be self-determined in accord with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And I feel that God has set our church on a good path, and it's a path, of course, that we walk in partnership with Indigenous peoples all across the country. And it's a path which we've been set. And we've begun this long journey. And we've come a long way. We've come a long way. Since 1993 in particular. We've got a long way to go yet. The Spirit is continuing to guide us and to guide us in good ways as we grow together in mutual respect as Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. Just a little bit of history, if I may, to set the stage then for some questions and answers. If we begin to think about truth and reconciliation in the era of the Indian schools in Canada, we're really moving back to 1857 and the Act for the Gradualization of the Indian Tribes in Canada. In 1883, Prime Minister John A. Macdonald addressed the House of Commons, and this is what he said. When the school is on the reserve, the child lives with his parents who are savages. He is surrounded by savages. And though he may learn to read and write, his habits of training and mode of thought are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write. So that's some very dramatic kind of discourse. And when we go back into history and colonial expansion that took place all across this country, with it, this doctrine of discovery, where lands are and they're considered empty, but if there are people living there, they're savages, and they need to be civilized. The Public Works Minister of Canada in 1883 said this: in order to educate the children properly, we must separate them from their families. Some people may say that that's hard, but if we want to civilize them, we must do that. So the government set up a few schools, only 3 originally, and then the churches began to establish Indian residential schools through the missionary societies. In our case, as Anglicans, the missionary societies, and through the Roman Catholic Church, largely through religious orders. And then in 1879, there was a kind of partnership that began to emerge between the government and the churches. I just want to share a quote with you from the then Indian Affairs Minister, Nicholas Davin. He recommended a partnership with the churches for 2 reasons. The first was moral. The type of education he was advocating would undermine existing spiritual and cultural beliefs, and it would be wrong, he said, to destroy their faith without supplying a better one, namely Christianity. The second reason was economic. He said teachers should be paid adequately, but by hiring missionaries, the government would get an enthusiastic person with therefore a motive power beyond anything pecuniary remuneration could supply. So the schools began to pop up all over the country through this partnership between the government and the churches. The purpose of the schools, according to all the original documents, civilize and Christianize. One of the documents says the purpose of the schools, purpose of assimilation is to kill the Indian and that child. In 1920, Duncan, who was the Indian Affairs Minister of the day, said, and I quote, "I worked for a day when there was not a single Indian in Canada who's not been absorbed into the body politic." So, a very radical policy of assimilation. And they recognized at the time that they couldn't simply go into communities and civilize and Christianize adults. And so they decided to go for the children and to remove the children from their families. And so by boatload, truckload, and plane load, the children were taken from their families. The residential school era lasted about 150 years. There were about 150,000 children, Indigenous children, who went to those schools. There were about 138 of the schools across the country, the majority of them being in the western part of the country, but certainly also northern Ontario and Quebec. The Anglican Church of Canada ran 36 of the Indian residential schools. And the principles of assimilation were enforced through punishment of many kinds. For instance, the children weren't allowed to speak their own language. Anything they brought to the school that was reflective of their own ancestry and culture was simply taken from them, and they would never, ever see it again. Even inside the same schools, brothers and sisters were not allowed to. And they would be punished if they tried to. The children, many of the children in many of the schools were abused physically, emotionally, sexually. Many were malnourished. Disease was rampant in many of the schools, and many children died while in residential school, and many, as we now sadly know, were buried in unmarked graves. And I've said repeatedly since the discovery of the unmarked graves that, you can have a reconciliation commission with a 1,000-page report and 94 calls to action, but nothing thus far has pricked the conscience of the country and the soul of people like the discovery of these unmarked graves of dear little children, most often buried at night. And then their parents were told, run away. So years and years of cover, years and years of deceit and lies. In the 1980s, the churches that ran residential schools, and they would include our own Anglican Church, the United Church, the Presbyterian Church, the Mennonite Church, and the Roman Catholic Church, mostly through religious orders, but a few dioceses. The churches began to listen to the stories of survivors of Indian residential schools, students who had survived what I call the arrogance of the policy of assimilation, the arrogance of a policy of assimilation, ancestral arrogance, cultural arrogance, social arrogance, and spiritual arrogance. And so the churches, as they began to listen to the students, the former students of the schools, and some of the horrendous experiences they had, began to make apologies. And in 1993, our then dear Prime Michael Pierce issued an apology on behalf of the Anglican Church of Canada. He did that at the request of the executive of the synod. And what they said to Michael at the time was, it's time, but we want you to decide the time and place where you make the apology on behalf of the church. And so Michael, I don't think he chose, I think he felt called to make the apology in the context of a native convocation in Pinawa in 1993. And many of us will remember that apology and the repeated lines, I am sorry more than I can say. And he identified the various kinds of abuse that happened and he could only speak, of course, for church, schools run by the Anglican Church. But he made those apologies for the abuse that happened. But he also said something powerful in saying that he was sorry that we were part of a system that tried to remake Indigenous children our image and likeness. That is to take away their Indigenous identity, their Indigenous dignity, their Indigenous culture and spirituality. Around the same time that Michael issued that apology, our church established in 1992, just the year before, something called the Anglican Healing Fund. And since 1992, the Anglican Healing Fund has provided funding for community initiative programs for healing and reconciliation. And it's everything from the healing of memories to the recovery of language and the recovery of culture and ceremonies associated with Indigenous spirituality. The TRC, Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, was established, and it was established to have some distance from the government. And its purpose, its mandate was to listen to the stories of Indigenous people who've been survivors of Indian residential schools, and to document that story. Heretofore, it was just not documented. And so the main thing that the three commissioners did as they traveled the country for several years was to listen to the stories of the survivors. And I had the great privilege of being at 6 of the 7 national events representing the Anglican Church of Canada. And like the commissioners, my only role there was to listen and to learn. And there were times as I listened to stories when I just would hang my head. Actually, and I'll be honest and say there were times when I just wanted to leave the room, but I couldn't, because that would be adding insult to injury. So I listened over my time in the Office of Climate to many, many stories that I heard of the gatherings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And it was interesting to see the movement through the 7 national events. I remember the very first one I went to, as people were telling their stories, they were very deep and personal, and it was raw. It was just so raw. And there was so much pain and so much anger in terms of the experience they personally had. I remember at the second and third ones, there was some of that, but then there was the beginning, there was a kind of a shift. As people told their stories, they were surrounded by family members. And I'll never forget to this day how many of the survivors told their story. And then they would just start to cry. And they'd turn around and they'd say to their family, "Please forgive me. I never learned how to love you. I never learned how to be a good." And so this impact on family life. And then as other gatherings took place, we began to learn more about not just the impact personally and their families, but the impact that we now call intergenerational trauma. And many of the crises that consume Indigenous communities have their roots in the intergenerational trauma arising from the legacy of the residential schools. When the TRC finished its work in 2015, they issued 94 calls to action. And that's what they are, calls to action. Action on the part of the government of Canada and action on the part of the churches who were in partnership during the era of the residential schools. There were a number of calls, or there are, I should say, a number of calls specifically directed to the churches. And they cover the topic of apologies. They cover the topic of education. That the church needs to educate itself on this particular chapter in its own history. And it addresses the whole question of spirituality of Indigenous peoples. And it calls, for instance, for theological colleges and seminaries to make sure that in their curriculum there are programs for those being prepared for ordination and for lay ministers to learn something about Indigenous spirituality and how it actually is not in conflict with the gospel, but how in many ways it complements the gospel, the seven sacred teachings. And to realize that Indigenous people were very open to receiving the gospel of Jesus, very open to it. And they continue to be very loyal to the gospel. In fact, one of the great strengths of the Indigenous church right now is something called gospel-based discipleship, where every single day they read a portion of the gospel and they reflect on it. And they ask themselves three questions. I've just read this passage of scripture from the gospel. First question is, what stands out for me? What word? What image? The second question is, what is Jesus saying to me? To us? And the third one, what is this gospel calling me to do? Calling us to do. So gospel-based discipleship really is a great source of strength for Indigenous people as they continue to celebrate the gospel. One of the things that I learned as primate, as I listened to survivors of residential schools speak at the TRC events and at gatherings of our own church called Sacred Circles, and through the Anglican Council of Indigenous Peoples, I began to think more and more about the apology of 1993. And Michael addressed physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. But as I listened more and more to people, I was hearing a deep yearning and a deep need for an apology for the spiritual harm that was part of the Indian residential school era. And so 2019 General Synod in Vancouver, I offered, and that's what you do, you offer an apology, you don't deliver it, you offer it. I offered an apology for spiritual harm on behalf of the Anglican Church of Canada. I also learned that with apology, you offer the apology, and then you just be quiet. And you give the space and time needed for people to begin try and digest what they've heard in terms of an expression of apology, contrition, an intention and desire to right the wrong past and to walk together in respectful ways. And I also learned that reconciliation is something that you can't contrive it. You cannot construct it. You can't assume it. And you certainly cannot rush it. Reconciliation, I've learned, is something that emerges. It emerges as people begin to sense there's some sincerity in the apology. They can see some actions on the part of the church that gives them some sense of integrity on the part of the church in saying, I'm sorry. And so reconciliation emerges, and it emerges in all kinds of beautiful ways, actually. Now, the other thing I want to just say a few things about, and then we'll open it to questions and answers, is one of the things that's particularly interesting about the Anglican Church of Canada and the journey through truth and reconciliation is that our church has actually quite a long history of conversation respecting self-determination for Indigenous peoples. And it goes actually back to 50 years. In 1969, our church commissioned a well-known Canadian sociologist, Charles Henry, to do a study of the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in our church. And his conclusion was that the relationship needs to change. It cannot continue. It needs to change, and he said it needs to be based on mutual respect, solidarity, and equality. So a whole new began to open up. Our church then moved through a number of years where we had what were called national native convocations. And as I mentioned earlier, it was at a convocation in Pinawa where Michael Pearce issued the apology in 1993. Those convocations were gatherings of Indigenous peoples from across the church. And they evolved into what we now know as sacred circles. And this is Indigenous leadership gathering and having conversations about the future of Indigenous peoples within the Anglican Church of Canada. One of the watershed moments in that journey was the Covenant of 1994 in Winnipeg, where 23 Indigenous elders crafted a covenant called Our Journey of Spiritual Renewal. And it basically rehearsed some of the sad history of the residential schools. It cited the crisis in their communities, and it cited their desire for a new way of being Indigenous within the Anglican Church of Canada. And they invited the church into partnership with any and all Indigenous people who wanted to create a truly Indigenous expression of the church. In 1995, the very next year, our General Synod accepted that end of partnership, and that began quite an intense period of renewed partnership, one with another, in realizing this vision. In 2005, a declaration called the Pinawa Declaration. This was again a gathering of Indigenous leaders, and they called in that gathering for the consecration of 15 Indigenous bishops across the country. And some people were just, really, you want to consecrate 15 Indigenous bishops? Well, since then, more than 20, probably 23 or 25 Indigenous men and women have been consecrated bishops in our church. A number of them are now retired, several of them are assisting bishops, and a number of them are diocesan bishops in dioceses that are largely Indigenous. From that Pinawa Declaration was also a call for the appointment of a national Indigenous bishop. So this would be someone who would work in a very close relationship with the primate of the Anglican Church of Canada. And so there was a period of discernment, and in 2007, just 2 years later, Mark MacDonald, who had been a former bishop in the Episcopal Church, the Bishop of Alaska, he was appointed and installed as the National Indigenous Bishop of the Anglican Church of Canada. And that was the same year that I was elected as primate of the Anglican Church of Canada. So Mark and I kind of began a journey together back in 2007. Mark was charged with the following things: to be their leader, to speak for Indigenous peoples, to express the authority of Indigenous peoples, to interpret for Indigenous people the way the Anglican Church of Canada governed itself, and to interpret to the Anglican Church of Canada the way Indigenous people, quote, govern themselves. And finally, to act as a midwife, language they used, to act as a midwife for the birthing of a self-determining Indigenous church. One of the great watershed moments in this journey was in 2010, when Lydia Mamika, an Indigenous archdeacon in the Diocese of Kiwi at the time, was elected to be a bishop. And we Anglicans are quite accustomed to a way of electing bishops where we gather in a great big church like this one, or a cathedral. And the laity sit on one side, and the clergy sit on the other side, and we pray, and we cast ballots, and we sing hymns, and we trust the Holy Spirit is at work among us. Well, when Lydia was elected, the decision was made by the local Archbishop, David Ashdown, and others, that it was time to honor the way in which Indigenous people would raise up a new leader. And so they gathered, and there were, I think, 4 or 5 names that had come forward to become bishop. And the way in which the people who were named went and stood against the wall, facing the wall, and then community by community came and stood behind the person whom they thought the Holy Spirit had already chosen to be bishop. And so Lydia was elected, and I remember being at her consecration. It was an absolutely joyous celebration. And that, her election, spawned a big conversation about the history of the Diocese of Kuwait, which basically went bankrupt through litigation arising from residential schools. And the diocese dissolved, and the spiritual ministry of the Shamash emerged with Lydia as the bishop. They now have a Suffragan bishop. His name is Larry. Larry was the name given to him when he went to residential school. His parents had actually named him Isaiah. And so he was consecrated Bishop Isaiah. In 2010, in Halifax, at General Synod, our church adopted a canon, church law, on the National Indigenous Ministry, which basically enshrined in the structures of our church the office of the National Indigenous Bishop, the place of the sacred circles, which for Indigenous people are kind of on par with the General Synod, and they enshrine the Council of Indigenous Peoples, which is on par with the Council of General Synod. In 2011, because of the continuing crisis in many Indigenous communities, there was a kind of plea that we move forward a little more quickly with developments with respect to a self-determined Indigenous church within the Anglican Church of Canada. In 2014, a kind of assessment where are we 20 years after the 1994 covenant? 2017, we have another national consultation Donald and I hosted called The Road to Warm Springs. And in 2019 at General Synod was a resolution empowering Indigenous peoples within our church to amend the canon on Indigenous ministries without having the permission of General Synod. So a significant development moving forward. And it was also at that General Synod that it was my great privilege on behalf of our church. I got the endorsement of the Council of General Synod to have the National Indigenous Bishop named Archbishop. Because I said that, you know, his ministry was not diocesan. His ministry really was a ministry of oversight for Indigenous peoples, in his case, all across the country. And so in a great celebratory, very emotional moment, I named him Archbishop. I anointed him on behalf of the church, and I gave him a cross. Most metropolitans carry a metropolitan cross. So we had one specially designed for Archbishop Mark, and it was very symbolic of Indigenous peoples in the life of our church. So our story of self-determination for Indigenous peoples continues. We have some ways to go. This year, Sacred Circle was a virtual gathering, like lots of dioceses, a virtual gathering, and they decided to do it in two parts. So they met in May, and they're meeting again later in October. And at this particular Sacred Circle, they are Indigenous people from across the country are looking at some final documents. The title of the documents is A Covenant, Our Way of Life. And so they will do some refining of the documents. Refining of the documents. And on National Aboriginal Day of Prayer, June 2022, the language that they're using is they want to seal the document and send it on to General Synod, which meets in Calgary next summer. Some of the primary pieces in it in terms of our way of life are gospel-based discipleship, as I mentioned earlier, Indigenous peoples leading Indigenous communities, training and formation for Indigenous leaders, ordained and lay, catechists, pastoral presence in Indigenous communities, addressing the tremendous crisis that many of the communities face with respect to poverty and addictions and suicide. Bishop Mark calls it a pandemic. And then there will be pieces in those documents that talk about us and honoring time-honored ways of governance and decision-making among Indigenous peoples. And for Indigenous peoples, the soul is just all important. Debate, parliamentary debate, not so. They're much more into listening, learning, discerning, stopping to pray for a while, leaving it, going for a walk, coming back to it, and really kind of going around the circle. And sometimes some of us might say, how many times are we going to go around the circle again? But it's to go around the circle until they sense that they're hearing both here and here what the Spirit is saying to the church. You know, we often will say now these days, hear what the Spirit is saying to the church. And before there's even a breath, we say, thanks be to God. Like that we actually take time to hear what the Spirit is saying to the church. So they model that in a very beautiful, quiet kind of way. So that's just to give us some sense of the history, and I hope that you get some sense from what I've shared with you, that I emerged out of my years in the office of the primate, not in a state of despair, certainly a state of sadness for what was and for what was not for so many years, but also a sense of real hopefulness for what the Spirit is doing among us. The last thing I'll say is that the commissioners were the TRC commissioners. I always found them very interested in what was going on in the Anglican Church, because they were picking up in their travels across the country, they were picking up stories of what the Anglican Church in Canada was doing with respect to trying to honor the rights of Indigenous people to be self-determined. And I understand why they would be interested in that, because they say in their preface to 94 Calls to Action that their reference point for the calls to action is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So you cannot talk about truth and reconciliation apart from self-determination. You can't talk about self-determination apart from truth and reconciliation. They go hand in hand. If something good and right and just and beautiful and pleasing to God is going to emerge. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred, very much for that wonderful survey. I'm sure I've learned a tremendous amount. I'm sure we all have. I'm also sure that it was a very challenging role to play for the past decade and a bit in that chair, being responsible for this historic church in this country, but for all our sins and failures as well, and to try and find a way forward. I'm sure the personal cost of that you felt deeply on many occasions.
Yes, I remember that. One of the things I've grown to love about Indigenous people too is that, given all they've gone through, they still have a sense of humor, and they still love the church, and they want to be a self-determining church within the Anglican Church of Canada. They don't want a church that's separate from the Anglican Church, even given our history. But let me just tell you that at the very first sacred circle that I was to go to, and this is something we all understand too, the primate of the Anglican Church of Canada is, quote, a guest at any meeting of the Anglican Council of Indigenous People. And the primate is a guest at a sacred circle. You only go by invitation. And I remember the very first sacred circle I went to in 2009, Donna Bomberry, and I've told this story many times, Donna Bomberry, who was the coordinator for Indigenous Ministries in the Synod, she sat me down, and I was still pretty new in the role, and she said, "Now, Fred, you've been invited to Sacred Circle." I said, "Oh, yes." So I'm really looking forward to it. And she said, "Here's the drill. Show up, speak up, shut up, and listen, and speak up at the end." So it was pretty clear. I got my marching orders. I was there to speak when I was invited to speak, but my primary role was simply there to listen and to learn. And then at the end, at every sacred circle, they would always invite the primate to offer hallmark for closing remarks. And I always had a sense that they knew whether you'd listened. Yeah. But I came to quite enjoy going to the sacred circles, and not unlike the TRC events, I can see as I think back the movement from the very first sacred circle I went to, where there was still a lot of raw emotion around people's experience of the residential school, a real kind of movement from that into who are we as Indigenous people in the Anglican Church of Canada? Who does God intend us to be in the Anglican Church of Canada? What do we have to contribute to the life and witness of the Anglican Church of Canada, to the gospel? And then as those questions work through, then the real kind of concerted efforts to structure Indigenous expressions of the church. And Indigenous peoples, of course, are, as you said in your opening prayers this evening, Peter, there are many, many Indigenous nations across the country. And I think that as you look at how the Indigenous church emerges, reality is it's going to look different, I think, from nation to nation. But there will be beautiful nation-to-nation relationships that I think will get enshrined in whatever happens as Sacred Circle finesses a document that goes to General Synod next year.
Your successor, Archbishop Linda Nichols, will be inheriting this new model of church, which isn't autonomous and separate. I'm just interested, do you have any sense of what the relationship of that self-determining church will be with the continuing office of the primate?
Yes, well, I think that what Indigenous people, I think, are hoping for, Peter, is that the National Indigenous Archbishop will be viewed as a kind of equal to the primate.
I see.
They look to the National Indigenous Archbishop as their, quote, pastoral leader, their pastoral and prophetic leader. And Bishop Mark has certainly exhibited that role in very distinguished ways in the last almost 20 years now. They will always, I think, have respect for the office of the primate. But I think that they will want to see the Archbishop, Indigenous Archbishop, as being on par with the primate, so that they are seen to be partners in this emerging of the self-determined Indigenous church. Fortunately, if you go right back to Howard's time as primate, Howard Clark, when he was primate back in the early 60s, well into the late 60s, Howard primate was the one who began to say, things aren't right. Things aren't right. We need to address the situation. There needs to be some change here. It's not a healthy relationship. And then, of course, we had dear Ted Scott, who was a real champion for Indigenous peoples and for human rights in general around the world. And then, of course, Michael invested a lot of his time in Indigenous ministries, and he will be forever remembered as the primate who issued the apology. And then Archbishop Andrew Hutchison, he was the one who installed Mark as the National Indigenous Bishop. And then I succeeded Andrew, and a few things happened during those years as well. So it's been I think, given the history, I think it's been a very cordial relationship.
It sounds like we've evolved faster than the federal government in our relationships.
Yes.
But that's another topic.
It's another topic, but it's a really important one, because I think that what I hear Indigenous people, have heard Indigenous people say, with all due respect, is that the churches that have issued apologies, for the most part, are acting on them. And what frustrates many Indigenous peoples is that the apology from the government in 2011, that action seems to be slow, taking a long time. And so that's just one very brief comment that I would make on that. Yes.
I'm wondering if we have some questions from our community here or online. Any questions from our community for Fred Hiltz?
Not yet.
Did you want to just say a word about the Anglican Council of Indigenous Peoples?
Sure.
What's the makeup of that group?
So the makeup of that group is, as I mentioned, Sacred Circle is for Indigenous people something akin or on par with General Synod. So General Synod is a body that consists of people elected from each diocese across the country. For Sacred Circle, that's a body which is representative of Indigenous peoples across the country, communities across the country. And the Council of Indigenous People is elected by the Sacred Circle in the same way that Council of General Synod is elected by General Synod. And the Council of Indigenous People is charged with by the Sacred Circle in terms of particularly taking next steps around what does a self-determining church begin to look like, what are the governance structures that need to be put in place, how will the local self-determining Indigenous church relate to local, quote, diocese? How will self-determining Indigenous church relate to the diocesan bishop? Because many Indigenous people are really quite content to say, well, yeah, she's our diocesan bishop, and he's our Indigenous bishop. They're quite content to live with that kind of relationship with a couple of bishops, and the council works at nurturing those kind of good relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous. The council also is really deeply committed to helping the church understand that yes, there's a lot of work to do with regard to a self-determining Indigenous church on reserve in Indigenous communities, but also reminding the church that currently in Canada, there are more Indigenous people living in the downtown core of large urban centers than on reserve lands. And so what does that look like? For instance, in downtown Toronto, we've urban Native ministries here in the Diocese of Toronto, but what will that look like as we go forward? So the Council of Indigenous Peoples, to say they're elected by Sacred Circle, that's basically their mandate. They report to every meeting of the Council of General Synod to respect to their work. and how that's moving forward. And they often have come to the Council of General Synod with significant documents for the Council's consideration. The thing we have to watch as the self-determining church continues to emerge is that we were so accustomed for so many years to using language like allowing or permitting, and now that's not the main thrust of our lingo. It's listening, it's learning, it's supporting, it's getting behind, getting alongside, so that, and in some cases, getting alongside means we get out of the way, so that the self-determining church can emerge. That's basically the role of the Anglican Council of Indigenous People. It's also a body that's advisory to the National Indigenous Archbishop. And the other thing I did not mention, but it's also pretty significant, is that in recent years, along with the Anglican Council of Indigenous Peoples, there's what's called the Indigenous House of Bishops Leadership Circle. So all the Indigenous bishops in Canada will meet from time to time with Archbishop Mark and do some strategizing, preparation in advance of meetings of the council.
I'm sure you've met Senator Murray Sinclair many times, and comment on his leadership. And I noticed your document, you referred to the National Animator for Reconciliation. Who is that?
The Animator for Reconciliation, working within the Anglican Church of Canada. Her name is Melanie Delvin. Now, Melanie is on leave currently, but she came on to our staff, must be close to 5 years ago now. I was still in the office when we appointed and commissioned her. And again, that was her appointment came about as an action of the Council of General Synod to really
Push this forward.
Push our commitment to the 94 calls to action forward. Exactly. So Melanie has done a lot of work. If you go on our Anglican Church of Canada website and click on Truth and Reconciliation, she's got all kinds of resource material there with historical documents, resource kits for conversations about reconciliation. And it's been a full-time position. And it's interesting because she came into the role having been an archivist. She was the archivist for the Diocese of New Westminster and the provincial archivist for the Ecclesiastical Province of British Columbia and Yukon. And one of the requirements of the TRC, one of the requirements of the churches, was the provision of all the archival records we had regarding the residential schools. So Melanie just kind of sunk her teeth into this task and had a huge passion for the work. The more she delved into it, and she seemed like the most incredible person we could have.
So we're not hiding anything.
Not at all. That's one of the things the Anglican Church is noted for. The TRC commissioners have all said that. It was, and I was in an interview perhaps 6 months ago, and we were asked that question. The local bishop and I, Archbishop Andrew Mon, she and I, because I'm assistant bishop in Moosonee, so this was after the discovery of the unmarked graves, and the question was, so what about the Anglican Church of Canada and archival records? And we were blessed to be able to say the Anglican Church of Canada and its dioceses have not withheld any information of an archival nature. And for many years when I was in the office, our General Synod archivist, her whole focus in her work was on meeting the requirements of the TRC for the archival records. So we are in good standing with respect to that, and we continue to be in good standing with regard to making sure that on the properties of any residential schools that were run by the Anglican Church of Canada, we don't own any of those properties anymore, to my knowledge. But there's a commitment on the part of dioceses where those schools were. Sure, the grounds are searched. So that's good. And with regard to Murray Sinclair, a fascinating figure, very powerful speaker, and he's very shrewd, and I think he can fairly quickly read a situation. But I have to say that at almost every national TRC event, I would have some moment of to have an exchange with him. And he and Marie Wilson, who's a very devout United Church member, those two in particular, they would always either comment on something they'd heard about what was going on in the Anglican Church of Canada, or they'd heard something and they wanted to ask me something further about it. And it was because they were intrigued by this connection, truth and reconciliation and self-determination. You can't have one without the other. And they could hear stories, and they only heard the stories from Indigenous people. I mean, we didn't go around telling them this. Indigenous people would be telling them, well, this is what's happened in our community, or this is what's happening in our church. So I think that Murray Sinclair would, and I understand this, I think he could be highly critical of the churches, and for good reason, and highly critical of government too. But while he could be highly critical of the churches and call the churches to account on no uncertain terms, he was always very interested when he was hearing some good things that were beginning to happen.
I'm wondering, are there any...
The other thing I would just say, just to finish the thing about Murray, is that Murray Sinclair was very impressed with the documentary that Anglican Video produced 3 years ago. Or
2 years ago.
2 years ago, is it? That's what happens when you get old and retired. 2018, Anglican Video produced this documentary called Stolen Land Strongholds. Many of you may be familiar with it. If you haven't seen it, you can simply go to it. It's online on the Anglican Church of Canada website. It's a 67-minute documentary, and Murray Sinclair and many others have said it's a must view, not just for church people, but for all Canadians. So that's high praise for Anglican Video and the documentary work that they did. One of the real drivers behind the production of the documentary was Ginny Doctor, who was the former coordinator for Indigenous ministries, who worked very closely with Archbishop Mark. Sadly, Ginny died this past summer. But her voice is a lovely theme throughout the whole documentary. As I said in an interview, Ginny's voice will never die as long as that documentary is shown. And it's a documentary too it's frank with regard to the history, but it's also got a real strong note of hope for new beginnings for our church and our relationship with Indigenous
I'm just wondering, as we draw an evening to the close, just to make it local, here we are in a parish church in the middle of Toronto. What, in your view, might we do as a congregation here, a local congregation, to participate in this process of truth and reconciliation and healing? Obviously, truth, we need to more, and you talk about the documentary. Tonight's discussion has been extremely illuminating. But is there something that you might suggest that we in this one congregation think about taking on? How can we contribute to this work in the Anglican Church of Canada?
And I don't know if you're doing this now or not, Peter, but I know that in a lot of Anglican churches now, there's there's an acknowledgement of the territories, for instance, on which we are situated, and sometimes that acknowledgement is actually part of the liturgy at the beginning of the liturgy. Sometimes it's simply a reminder that's in the Sunday book. We live and move and have our being on the territorial lands, the ancestral lands of, and you find out which Indigenous nations for whom these lands are ancestral. So that's one thing that happens. There are some parishes that I know are beginning to put the calls to action out there. There's 94 of them, and so what they're doing is they're putting so many a week in the Sunday bulletin, and so people are able to read those calls to action. Fortunately, the 94 calls to action are helpfully organized into categories, and so they open with child welfare, for instance. Wow, there's a whole pile of stuff. Child welfare and the number of Indigenous children that are in foster care, and it's said these days that there are more children in foster care than at any time in the history of residential schools. So anyway, so many calls to action in the bulletin. And that creates opportunities sometimes for people to say, I didn't know that, or I'd like to know more about that, or so it both informs people and it makes them begin to ask questions, open conversations. So that's a second thing. In the parish I'm serving right now, St. Dunstan of Canterbury. They have a midweek Eucharist with a Bible study after it. And the first time I met with them in September, I said, well, what would you like to do for the Bible study? And anyway, we kind of went around the circle, and I had written a pastoral letter before I went there, and I said that I was really interested in trying to get the calls to action out there in the church so more people are aware of them. And so someone suggested that for our Bible study on Wednesday mornings, maybe we could have a biblically grounded conversation about truth and healing and reconciliation, and look at the calls to action. So that's what we're doing. Every Wednesday morning, we take so many of the calls to action and we have a conversation about them within the context of a biblical reflection. That's another thing. The other thing that I think is helpful is in a diocese like Toronto, what would the relationship be, for instance, between Grace Church and Toronto Urban Ministries? What would that look like? Perhaps we invite Lee Curran, who serves in that ministry now. Perhaps we invite her to come and preach on Sunday, or to have a town hall like we're having. And because, you know, we're so far removed, as you said, Peter, from Indigenous communities up north, but we have a huge Indigenous population in downtown Toronto. So what might that relationship look like? What would be the needs of Toronto urban ministries? And how might a parish like this one come alongside and provide some support? That's another thing that could be done, I think.
We had Archbishop MacDonald here, and it was very informative
Sure.
in a sort of panoramic way.
Yeah.
But I think it's the specific ways, ongoing ways.
Yes, and I think that's, you know, it makes it, when you know you're making a difference in the lives of people right here in downtown Toronto, where Indigenous peoples are there's a huge population, lots and lots of needs. How can we as a parish come alongside and respond in good and generous ways? Another thing that I think parishes could be doing, I tried to advocate this when I went to the private, not entirely with great success, I might add, but I often said that I thought that it would be wonderful if we could have combining relationships with parishes in the north and the south. So if there were, do you have that?
We have tried to do that.
You've tried to do that, yes.
With not much success, but we have tried to do that.
Well, maybe in my role as assistant bishop of OCD,
Well, there you go.
I might be able to help forge a relationship because you know in OCD, most of the parishes, particularly in the James Bay, which really literally wraps around James Bay, they're all Indigenous parishes. And if you were interested in forging a partnership with a particular parish or parishes,
Yes.
because some of them are quite, there's one huge one, which is Haskell. Most of the others are small.
Yeah.
But if you were interested in forging a partnership between them, I think that would be wonderful, because it could be a partnership in which we're supporting one another prayerfully.
Right.
And if there's
And learning.
And if there were particular projects
Right.
that needed some support within Indigenous communities, there's an opportunity.
Well, let's follow up on that, since you're the Bishop of Sydney at the moment.
I'm the assistant.
Well, that's a good idea.
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to.
Thank you. Well, why don't we call this wonderful conversation to an end? I'm so grateful to you for taking the time on a Sunday evening. I know you're busy in church today, many services, but coming here this evening and informing us and inspiring us and giving us hope for our church, and that we can be part of this path and pilgrimage to a better church, a better future. We'd like to play some small part in that. I know all of us here would. And so thank you for letting me about how we might make some further steps in this. Come on. Is there one question?
Maria, can you
Just
repeat some of those questions? Because I didn't quite
summarize
catch
that.
Yeah, I think the question is, why is it for her as an international student and new to the country, she and her daughter were affected by what watched in the documentary, but on Orange Shirt Day, she and her daughter, she had gone out and had worn an orange t-shirt. Why is it the people around her didn't seem to be interested or didn't seem concerned or didn't seem to know it was Orange Shirt Day, and nobody else seemed to be wearing orange shirts or to even acknowledge that it was a day to remember the children in the residential schools. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. That's a very, very pointed question. And I think that, Orange Shirt, when Canada Day was observed this year, we probably all saw that in places where there were ceremonies, because Canada Day was just kind of low key this year, in light of the discovery of the unmarked graves. There's a kind of stain on the soul of Canada to think that this could happen to children in Canada. And it goes back to the drivenness to assimilate, to kill the Indian child. Some people would use the language as an attempt at genocide in Canada's history. And so because of the discovery of unmarked graves, more people were wearing orange on Canada Day than red and white. Flags were lowered to half-mast, and for a couple months past Canada Day. But Orange Shirt Day is actually, as you know, your daughter wore, is in September, and it simply goes back to the story of a young Indigenous girl who was 6 years old in British Columbia, who was going to what was called the mission, and her grandmother bought her this new sparkly orange shirt that she loved. She wore it to the mission, and it was taken from her, and she never saw it again. And so she started this movement called Orange Shirt Day, and Orange Shirt Day has just become the orange shirt has become a symbol not just of the loss of her t-shirt, but the many losses that Indigenous children experienced in the course of the residential schools. The loss of their identity, their dignity, the loss of family, the loss of relationship even with siblings, the loss of language, their culture, their spirituality, in some cases their virginity. So it's become that symbol. In response directly to your question, I think the only thing I can say is that perhaps the church's role is to play its part in telling the story of Orange Shirt Day and making the Sunday nearest Orange Shirt Day Truth and Reconciliation Sunday. In the parish I'm serving right now, for Holy Cross Day, I constructed a 6-foot wooden cross, and it was decorated beautifully with flowers and so on through the season of creation. For TRC Sunday, I hung an orange shirt on the cross. And I said to the altar guild, and I asked for permission, could we not have fancy hangings on the altar for that Sunday? And Lynn and I had gone to Fabricant and bought a piece of orange cloth, and we draped it over the altar as kind of a super fair linen, and then sort of decorated around the foot of the altar with moccasins and sweetgrass and so on, symbols of Indigenous ancestry and spirituality. And the whole focus for that liturgy was truth and reconciliation. So a kind of education event for many folks. I think it's sometimes those small things that we do that help people learn more about it, that will turn the tide. I think too that more and more schools are going to be doing something around Orange Shirt Day, and making sure that people understand what it's about, and encouraging people to come along with the journey of healing and reconciliation.
You want to summarize, Marie?
Yeah, Lucia is saying that she's not able to find a lot of information on the internet, it seems. And as a newcomer, maybe she needs to be given the links to find those things. What she's saying is that she's unable to find more information. And well, in this church, there is a library, and there is a good selection of books you can read. So since you are here, I would suggest one of the things you can do is to use this library, and the books are there that would be a good start. And then maybe the librarian can help you with some of the links, and maybe through the Anglican Church of Canada, the website itself, rather than just going to Google, because you might, you'll be sent to all kinds of places, and the information will be quite mixed. So the other thing that was mentioned was the Toronto Urban Ministries. They would have a web as well, right?
Yes, I think if you go on the Diocese of Toronto website and click on Toronto Urban Ministries, you will go directly to.
Yeah.
We can follow up.
Yeah. So we will help you with finding the links that will be helpful in your learning and in your discovery.
And just to underscore what you're saying, Maria, the Anglican Church of Canada, if you go on the website for the Anglican Church of Canada and click on Truth and Reconciliation and Indigenous Ministries, you will find there loads of information about the history of our church's relationship with ministries, with a lot of the history associated with the residential schools, and you will find a whole tracking of the history of our church's commitment to walk with Indigenous peoples in creating a self-determining Indigenous church. The other thing I want to say is that if you wanted something in print, there's this document called the National Indigenous Ministry, Our Story of Self-Determination. And that's kind of a chronicling of the history of self-determination for Indigenous people within the Anglican until 2019. It's a really good publication. It was produced for every member of General Synod.
We can probably.
And you could probably, yes, you can get that. You can get that through the Anglican Church of Canada Office of the National Indigenous Bishop. And the other thing that I would want to hold up in your question, because it's an opportunity to put a plug in for the center, the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, which is in Winnipeg. And they have piles of resources on the history of the residential school era. And a lot of the resources they have been produced by the TRC, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and a body called the Residential Schools Survivors Society. This book, which I have in my hand, is called They Came for the Children. And it's quite an amazing book produced by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission several years ago now, but it gives you the history of the schools and some of the experiences people. But the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation in Winnipeg, again, if you go on their website, you will find plenty of material to help you, I think.
Well, thank you, Fred, so generously sharing your insights from your very deep and broad experience as a leader of our church. This has been very helpful to all of us, and I think it's given us some ideas locally about next steps. So thank you for your gift of your presence and time tonight.
Thank you for the opportunity.
I'm wondering whether you'd consider closing our evening with a prayer and a blessing and helping us on our way tonight.
All right, thank you. We're happy to do that. A couple of prayers which over the years, and I continue to pray them. And so if I may offer two prayers here. One is called, so one is in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, and it's called Remembering the Children. And it was written in 2009 when Canada's Truth and Reconciliation was just getting launched. Let us pray. God of our ancestors, who holds the spirits of our grandmothers and grandfathers and the spirit of our grandchildren. Remembering the children, we now pledge ourselves to speak the truth and with our hearts and our souls to act upon the truth we have heard. Of the injustices lived, of the sufferings inflicted, of the tears cried, of the misguided intentions imposed, and of the power of prejudice and racism, which smothered the sounds and laughter of the forgotten children. Hear our cries of lament for what was allowed to happen and for what never be. In speaking and hearing and acting on the truth, may we as individuals and as a nation meet the hope of a new beginning. Great Creator God, who desires that all creation live in harmony and peace, remembering the children, we dare to dream of a path of reconciliation, where apology from the heart leads to healing of the heart. and the chance of restoring the circle, where justice walks with all, where respect leads to true partnership, where the power to change comes from. Hear our prayer of hope, O God, and guide this country of Canada on a new and different path. Amen.
Amen.
And the prayer of Indigenous people as they continue on the journey of self-determination. Creator, we give you thanks for all you are and all you bring to us for our visit within your creation. In Jesus, you place the gospel in the center of our sacred circle, through all of which creation is related. You show us the way to live a generous and compassionate life. Give us your strength to live together with respect and commitment as we grow in your spirit, for you are God, now and forever. Amen.
Amen.
Mercifully grant that your people, journeying together in partnership, may be strengthened and guided to help one another to grow to the full stature of Christ, who is our light and our life.
Amen.
May the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May he lift up the light of his countenance, grant you peace this night and forevermore.
Amen. And thank you, the Reverend Marilyn, for helping
Yes.
facilitate tonight.
Thank you.
This letter.
Wonderful.
Thank you all. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Good night and thank you.